Hold on, folks. Henny B is going to peddle something. Ask anyone that knows me, they'll tell you I am not an energy drink kind of guy. I am naturally hyper as it is, and I don't need it. But I know a lot of people who are, and lately they've been drinking Dubby like it's going out of style. Dubby is a flavored powdered supplement that you mix directly into your water. It promises no crash, no jitters, no angst. Head over to Dubby.gg today and enter the coupon code WW1POD for a 10% discount. That's Dubby.gg, and it's proudly made in the USA. I'm Henny B, and welcome to the World War I Stories podcast, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it. Some scenes in these stories may be too graphic for sensitive listeners, so listener discretion is advised. This episode, Shadows of Gallipoli. The rumble of typewriters echoed through the narrow corridors of the Admiralty, punctuated by the occasional clattering of footsteps on the polished wooden floors. In a small, dimly lit room tucked away in a corner of the building, Lieutenant Edward Harrington bent over a ledger, meticulously recording the latest inventory of naval supplies. His fingers, stained with ink, moved deftly across the pages as he tallied crates of ammunition, barrels of fuel, and other critical resources. Edward had been an inventory clerk for nearly 2 years, a role that demanded precision and patience, but offered little in the way of excitement or recognition. He often dreamed of playing a more significant part in the war effort, of being at the heart of decisions that could shape the future. Yet, for now, his world was confined to the columns of figures and lists of supplies. Edward had always been a man of precision, a trait he inherited from his father, a watchmaker in a small village in Sussex. The war had taken his father, leaving Edward with a determination to honor his memory by serving with the same meticulous care. As he finished the last entry, the door to the inventory room creaked open. Edward looked up to see Captain James McAllister, his immediate superior, standing in the doorway. McAllister was a stern man with a no-nonsense demeanor, and his presence usually signaled a new task or a problem to be addressed. "Lieutenant Harrington," McAllister began, his voice gruff but not unkind, "the First Lord of the Admiralty has requested to see you." Edward's heart skipped a beat. "Winston Churchill wants to see me, sir?" "Yes, Churchill," McAllister confirmed, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "It seems your meticulous work has not gone unnoticed. Report to his office immediately." Edward quickly straightened his uniform, smoothing out any creases, and followed McAllister through the halls of the Admiralty. His mind raced with questions and possibilities. Why would Churchill want to see him? What could this mean for his future? They arrived at a large oak door adorned with a brass nameplate that read, "First Lord of the Admiralty." McAllister knocked briskly, and after a moment a voice called from within, "Enter." The office was spacious, filled with the scent of cigar smoke and the faint aroma of leather-bound books. Maps and naval charts covered the walls, and the large mahogany desk was piled high with documents and reports. Behind it sat Winston Churchill, a man whose presence seemed to fill the room. His eyes were sharp, and his expression, though serious, held a spark of curiosity. "Lieutenant Harrington, I presume," Churchill said, his voice resonant and commanding. "Yes, sir," Edward replied, standing at attention. "At ease, Lieutenant," Churchill said, gesturing to a chair. "Please, sit." Edward took a seat, trying to mask his nervousness. Churchill leaned back in his chair, studying him for a moment before speaking. Churchill tapped a pile of reports with the palm of his hand. "I've been reviewing the logistics and supply reports, and I must say, your work is exceptionally thorough. In these uncertain times, attention to detail is crucial, and your diligence is not gone unnoticed." "Thank you, sir," Edward said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. Churchill nodded. "I need someone with your skills and dedication to assist me directly. The Gallipoli Campaign is of the utmost importance, and I require an aide who can manage the flow of information and ensure that every detail is accounted for. Would you be willing to accept this position?" Edward's heart soared. This was the opportunity he had longed for, a chance to be at the heart of the action, to contribute meaningfully to the war effort. "It would be an honor, sir," he replied earnestly. "Excellent," Churchill said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Report to my office at 0700 hours tomorrow. We have much to discuss, and even more to do." As Edward left Churchill's office, he felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The weight of responsibility now rested on his shoulders, but the opportunity to work directly with one of the most influential figures of the time was an honor he could hardly fathom. Edward arrived at the Admiralty well before dawn, the chill of the early morning air invigorating him as he made his way to Churchill's office. He paused outside the door, taking a deep breath to steady himself before knocking. "Enter," came Churchill's voice from within. Edward stepped inside to find Churchill already at his desk, surrounded by maps and documents. The room was a hive of activity, with aides and officers coming in and out, delivering messages and reports. "Ah, Harrington, punctual as expected," Churchill said, looking up with a nod of approval. "Come, let me introduce you to the team." Edward was introduced to a flurry of faces, each person involved in different aspects of the Gallipoli campaign. There was Commander Thompson, the strategic genius behind naval operations, Major Hamilton, responsible for coordinating ground forces, and Miss Clara Reynolds, Churchill's personal secretary, who seemed to have an encyclopedic knowledge of every ongoing operation. "Your first task," Churchill said, handing Edward a thick folder, "is to review these intelligence reports. We need to identify any gaps in our current strategy and propose adjustments. Time is of the essence." Edward took the folder, feeling the weight of it both literally and figuratively. He found an empty desk in the corner and began to sift through the reports, his mind racing as he absorbed the information. Hours passed in a blur as he compiled the notes and formulated his recommendations. By noon, Edward had prepared a detailed summary of his findings. He approached Churchill's desk, waiting for an opportune moment to present his work. Churchill, engrossed in a heated discussion with Commander Thompson, finally looked up and motioned for Edward to speak. He fidgeted nervously. "Sir, I've completed the review of the intelligence reports," he began, handing over his summary. "There are several critical points that need immediate attention. Firstly, our reconnaissance suggests that the Ottoman defenses are far more entrenched than previously estimated. We need additional artillery support to break through those lines. Secondly, the supply routes are vulnerable to enemy raids. We must secure these routes to ensure the steady flow of resources." Churchill scanned the summary, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he looked up, his eyes locking onto Edward's. "Good job. I want you to present these findings at our next briefing." This was something he had not expected. Churchill must have noticed the flash of dread in his eyes. "Son, you'll do fine. Speak to all of them just as you spoke to me just now." Edward took a deep breath. "Thank you, sir. I'll be ready." Then he turned and made his way back to his little desk. "This is wild," he thought to himself. The briefing room was filled with senior officers and strategists, each one focused on the large map of the Gallipoli Peninsula that dominated the center of the room. Edward stood by Churchill's side, a stack of documents in his hands. "Gentlemen," Churchill began, "Lieutenant Harrington has prepared a comprehensive analysis of our current situation. His insights are invaluable, and I trust you'll give him your full attention." Edward stepped forward, his voice steady and clear as he outlined his findings and recommendations. The room listened intently, nodding in agreement as he highlighted key points and proposed adjustments to their strategy. When he finished, the room erupted in a chaos of approval. Even the usually stoic Commander Thompson offered a rare nod of respect. Churchill clapped a hand on Edward's shoulder, a gesture of both approval and camaraderie. "Well done, Harrington," Churchill said. "You were nervous for nothing." As Edward left the briefing room, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he was now part of something far greater than himself. The responsibility was immense, but so was the potential to make a meaningful difference. With Churchill's confidence in him, Edward resolved to dedicate every ounce of his energy and intellect to the success of the Gallipoli Campaign. The next morning, the Admiralty room was its usual hive of activity, with officers and strategists poring over maps and dispatches from the front lines. The air was thick with tension and the low hum of urgent conversations. In the corner of the room, Edward was meticulously reviewing supply lists, his brow furrowed in concentration. But he could faintly hear Churchill talking with Commander James Thompson. It seemed like an intense discussion. "Harrington," Churchill bellowed. Edward snapped up and stood at attention, his heart pounding. "Yes, sir." Churchill looked at him with impatience. "Well, don't just stand there. Get over here." Edward relaxed a bit and walked across the room to Churchill's desk where the two men seemed to be sizing him up. "Commander Thompson has recommended you for a critical assignment," Churchill said, his tone serious. "You are to travel to the front lines at Gallipoli and compile a detailed report on the situation. We need accurate, first-hand information that we can trust. Do you think you can handle that?" Edward felt a surge of both excitement and apprehension. The opportunity to see the front lines and contribute meaningfully to the campaign was immense, but so were the stakes. "I understand, sir. I will ensure that you receive a thorough and accurate report." Thompson stepped forward, handing Edward a sealed envelope. "These are your orders, Harrington. You'll depart immediately. Liaison with our field commanders and gather as much first-hand information as possible. Your observations will be critical to our next steps." Edward took the envelope, nodding resolutely. "I won't let you down, sir." Churchill rose from his chair, walked around his desk, and placed a hand on Edward's shoulder, a gesture of both encouragement and expectation. "I have full confidence in you, Harrington. Your diligence and integrity are precisely what we need right now. Godspeed." The journey to Gallipoli was scenic but arduous. Edward first traveled by ship to France, the rough seas and constant threat of enemy submarines a stark reminder of the danger. In France, he entrenched with a British regiment being transported to a small town in Belgium called Ypres by way of Paris. From Paris, Edward was put on a transport truck where he passed through Switzerland on the way to Venice in Italy. In Venice, for the final leg of his journey, he boarded a troop ship joined by 8 regiments of Australian and New Zealand troops that were commonly referred to as Anzacs. He and the soldiers marveled at the scenery they saw as the ship traversed first the Adriatic Sea, then the Aegean Sea before finally mooring up on the shores of the Gallipoli Peninsula. Stepping off of the ship, Edward was met by a young lieutenant who guided him through the chaos of the landing zone. Soldiers hurried about their duties, their faces etched with fatigue and determination. Edward felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he was fitted with a helmet and told to stay low as he approached the front lines. The weight of responsibility was heavy, and the fear of letting down those who had placed their trust in him also gnawed at his resolve. The field headquarters was a hastily erected tent filled with maps, radios, and a constant buzz of activity. Edward was introduced to the field commander, a grizzled veteran named Miller with a scar running down his cheek. Miller looked him up and down. "Another desk officer sent to tell us how to fight?" Edward straightened his back, meeting his gaze. "I'm here to understand your reality, Commander. The success of our operations depend on it." Miller nodded curtly. "Very well, Lieutenant. Follow me." The sun was setting over Gallipoli, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. Edward Harrington found himself in the trenches, surrounded by soldiers who had been fighting for days on end. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, a constant reminder of the ongoing conflict. The distant rumble of artillery was punctuated by the occasional crack of rifle fire, each sound sending a shiver down his spine. Edward had spent the day gathering information, speaking with those in charge and observing the conditions of the troops. But now, as night began to fall, he found himself on the front lines, witnessing the effects of battle firsthand. A sudden explosion rocked the trench, sending a shower of dirt and debris into the air. Edward instinctively ducked, his heart pounding in his chest. Around him, soldiers scrambled to take cover, their faces etched with fear and determination. "Incoming!" someone shouted, and another explosion followed. Closer this time. The ground shook, and Edward could feel the shock wave reverberate through his body. He clenched his teeth, trying to steady his nerves. As the dust settled, Edward saw a young soldier lying on the ground, clutching his leg where shrapnel had torn through his flesh. Blood was pooling around him, staining the dirt a dark crimson. The soldier's eyes were wide with pain and terror. "Medic!" Edward yelled, dropping to his knees beside the wounded man. He tore a strip of cloth from his own uniform and pressed it against the wound, trying to stem the bleeding. The young soldier's breath came in ragged gasps, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Hold on," Edward urged, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "The medic will be here soon." The soldier's eyes locked onto his, a mixture of pain and fear reflected in them. "Am I going to make it, sir?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Edward forced a reassuring smile, even as he felt a knot tight in his stomach. "You're gonna be fine. Just hold on a little longer." Moments later, a medic arrived, his face grim as he assessed the situation. He took over for Edward, applying a tourniquet to the soldier's leg and administering morphine to ease the pain. Edward watched, feeling a sense of helplessness wash over him. He had seen the numbers, the reports, the strategic maps, but nothing could have prepared him for the visceral reality of war. A sergeant approached, his face lined with weariness and dirt. "Lieutenant Harrington," he said, his voice carrying a weight of experience. "We need to move. The enemy is preparing for another assault." Edward nodded, rising to his feet. He cast one last glance at the wounded soldier who was now being carried away on a stretcher. "Stay strong," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The sergeant led Edward further down the trench where the soldiers were hastily reinforcing their positions. Sandbags were being stacked, and machine guns were being set up at strategic points. The tension in the air was substantial, a collective anticipation of the battle to come. "What's the situation?" Edward asked, trying to focus on the task at hand. The sergeant pointed towards the enemy lines, barely visible in the fading light. "They're massing for an attack. We've got reports of heavy artillery and infantry moving into position. It's going to be a tough night." Edward took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He had to stay focused, to gather the information that would help shape their strategy. But as he looked around at the faces of the men preparing for battle, he felt a deep sense of empathy and respect. These were not just numbers on a report. They were individuals, each with their own fears and hopes. The first shells began to fall, exploding with the deafening roars that shook the ground. Edward felt the impact in his bones, the sheer power of the artillery reminding him of the brutal reality of war. He crouched low, moving through the trench and observing the soldiers as they returned fire, their faces set with grim determination. Amidst the chaos, the field commander, the grizzled veteran with the scar on his cheek, Miller, appeared, his voice cut through the cacophony like a knife. "Lieutenant Harrington," he bellowed, his eyes wide with urgency, "you shouldn't be here." Edward tried to protest, but Miller would have none of it. "Sergeant, get him the bloody hell out of here," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Churchill would hang all of us if we lose him. Move it now." Two soldiers grabbed Edward by the arms, pulling him away from the front line. He struggled briefly, wanting to stay and help, but the commander's words echoed in his mind. His position at the Admiralty meant that he had a different role to play, one that could potentially save even more lives if he survived to deliver his report. "Go, Lieutenant," Miller shouted over the din of battle. "We'll hold the line. Just make sure your report gets to those who need it." Edward finally relented, allowing himself to be led away from the front lines. As he was hustled through the trenches, the sound of battle raged behind him, the relentless barrage of artillery, the staccato bursts of machine gun fire, the cries of the wounded and the dying. The horror of it seared itself into his memory, a stark reminder of the stakes they were all fighting for. They reached a safer section of the trench and the soldiers released their grip on him. Edward took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He looked back towards the front line where the commander and his men continued to fight with unwavering resolve. "Thank you," Edward said, his voice barely audible over the noise of battle. The soldiers nodded, their faces hardened by experience but softened by a shared understanding. Edward turned and began making his way back to the field headquarters, his mind racing with the images and sounds he had just witnessed. He knew that the information he carried was now more crucial than ever. The bravery and sacrifice of the men on the front lines deserved nothing less than his absolute best. As he approached the headquarters, he resolved to ensure that their efforts and their lives would not be in vain. He would deliver his report, and he would fight with every ounce of his being to see that their mission succeeded. He had only seen a sliver of battle in the grand scheme of things, but the horrors of Gallipoli had left a deep mark on him, but they had also strengthened his resolve. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready to face it for the sake of those who fought and fell on these rugged shores. Inside the relative safety of the command post, Edward found a table and spread out his notes. He quickly began to compile his observations, detailing the conditions of the troops, the strategic movements of the enemy, and the dire need for reinforcements and supplies. His hand shook slightly as he wrote, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. An officer approached him, recognizing Edward from earlier briefings. "Lieutenant Harrington, are you all right?" he asked, concern etched in his features. Edward nodded, though he could still hear the distant echoes of battle in his mind. "I'm fine, I just need to get this report finished." The officer glanced at the papers, understanding their urgency. "We'll make sure it gets to where it needs to go. Your work is critical, Lieutenant." Edward managed a small, grateful smile. "Thank you. I just hope it makes a difference." The officer placed a reassuring hand on Edward's shoulder. "It will. Every piece of information, every detail, it all matters. You're doing your part, just like the men out there." With renewed determination, Edward continued his work, the sounds of the battlefield fading into the background. He knew that the fate of many depended on the information he was gathering. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but it was a burden he was willing to bear. As the night wore on, the chaos of battle continued, but Edward remained focused. He was driven by the faces of the soldiers he had seen, the bravery of the commander and his men, and the hope that their efforts would lead to a brighter future. In the darkness of Gallipoli, amidst the horrors of war, Edward found his purpose and his resolve, knowing that he was a part of something much larger than himself. Weeks had passed since Edward Harrington had returned from the front lines of Gallipoli, but the memories of the battlefield still haunted him. The sights, the sounds, the smells, they lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of the sacrifices made by so many. He had poured his heart and soul into his report, detailing the dire situation and the urgent need for reinforcements and supplies. He had hoped it would make a difference, but now, standing outside the Admiralty office, he felt the crushing weight of failure. The news had spread quickly through the ranks. Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, was about to resign. The Gallipoli Campaign had been a disastrous failure, and the blame had fallen squarely on his shoulders. Edward had been summoned to witness the resignation, a gesture that felt more like a form of penance than an honor. The corridors of the Admiralty were hushed, the usual bustle and energy subdued by the gravity of the situation. Edward walked with heavy steps, his mind replaying the moments he had seen on the front lines. The young soldier's fearful eyes, the commander's unwavering determination, the chaos and carnage of battle. He had believed his report could change the course of events, but it had not been enough. As he entered the meeting room, he saw Churchill standing by the window, his back to the room. The usually formidable man seemed smaller, his shoulders slumped under the weight of responsibility and regret. A few senior officers and officials were gathered, their expressions somber. Churchill turned to face them, his face etched with exhaustion and sorrow. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Gentlemen, I've called you here today to announce my resignation as First Lord of the Admiralty." There was a heavy silence, the words hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Edward felt his heart sink further, the guilt and contrition gnawing at him. He had failed those men, failed to convey the urgency of their plight, failed to prevent this outcome. Churchill continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. The Gallipoli Campaign was a bold endeavor and one that I believed could change the course of this war. But it has become painfully clear that it was a grave miscalculation. The losses we've suffered are immeasurable, and the responsibility lies with me. Edward's throat tightened, his mind flashing back to the trenches, to the faces of the men who had fought and died. He had seen their bravery, their hope, and their despair. He had tried to capture it all in his report, but it had not been enough to change the tide. I am deeply sorry for the lives lost and the sacrifices made, Churchill said, his voice breaking slightly. I take full responsibility for this failure, and I will step down to allow new leadership to guide us through these dark times. The room remained silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone present. Edward felt a lump in his throat, his own sense of responsibility overwhelming him. He had been there, seen it all, and yet his efforts had not been enough to avert this tragedy. As Churchill finished speaking, he looked directly at Edward, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. Lieutenant Harrington, I know you were there, on the front lines. Your report was thorough and heartfelt. The failure is not yours to bear. We all share in this burden. Edward nodded, though the words did little to ease his guilt. He felt the weight of every life lost, every dream shattered, every hope extinguished. He had believed in the power of his report, but reality had proven far more relentless and unforgiving. Churchill walked out of the room. A few minutes later, Edward followed suit. He made his way to his little office adjacent to another conference room. There was an empty box waiting for him on his desk. He packed his belongings and made his way back to the dimly lit room where he would resume his old position of reconciling the inventory of naval supplies. This has been World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the show wherever you find this podcast, and don't forget to throw us a comment and a rating. We are on Facebook. Just search and like the official World War I Stories page. You can also join me on Blue Sky, where I go by the handle WW1Stories_HennyB. World War I Stories is now featured on Rabbit in Red Radio, with new episodes streaming Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. They also have all episodes available on demand. Visit Rabbit in Red Radio for this and many other independent podcasts. And last but not least, would you like your name read on the show? Become a producer by contributing to our Patreon at patreon.com World War I Stories. I'm very grateful to everyone who downloads and listens to this show. I'm Henny B, and see you next time on World War I Stories.